Hi, guys. I'm Jules, and this is the first episode of It's a Guy Thing. And I'm really excited because I have been waiting to be doing this podcast for quite some time now. And honestly, I've really thought about like, oh my gosh, like, am I gonna do like an intro to myself and whatnot? But honestly, I feel like you're gonna learn so much about a lot of my experiences that I have been through young adult, through childhood, going on more of that adulthood age. So I was like, you know what? I spilled the whole, hi, my name is so and so. I'm 25. I'm from, everywhere. I'm like, you know what? You guys are gonna get that later on, just throughout the whole podcast. So I wanted to be very, very intentional with the first episode of this podcast just because it's literally the beginning. And what better way to start a podcast than to start at the root? And I know that can be really scary just because, like, you actually have to dissect and you have to start finding some sort of like analyzation of, oh crap, like I actually have to dig deep into what's being asked of me. I'm going to be reading a lot of the things that I have written down just because I want to make sure I touch base on everything. So, pretty much, my objective for this whole episode is unraveling the root of emotional absence of men and the collateral damage of a broken household that causes men to act the way they act and treat not only themselves but those around them. And so I know I touched base a little bit on that on my trailer. If you haven't listened to that already, I really want men to understand why they do the things that they do. And essentially, I want women to understand why men do these things because I feel like a lot of women tend to be a little bit clueless of like, why is this like, why is my boyfriend acting like this, or why is the man I'm talking to, treating me a certain way, or why is he talking to several women with me in this talking stage per se. And so essentially I want to really dissect that. So without further ado, let's get into it. So the first portion that I want to go over is a pretty basic section. Pretty much I really want us to understand, what does it mean to like, go to the root of something. And essentially I always like to think of the analogy of a plant. Like, the plant always starts with the seed. Sometimes it even starts before the seed. And so honestly, this is like a prerequisite of understanding who we are, the characteristics that we carry, the traits that have been passed down to us. And so, the one thing that I really want all of you guys to understand is going further than your parents, like far back, maybe even like as far as your great grandparents, just because these things are more generational than you think. It's not something that you adapted from social media. It's not something that you got used to with your friends. Like, a lot of these things have been embedded in our DNA, but it's not something that we have to carry. So let's not get too wrapped up in, oh, well, this is just how I am. I've always loved the quote. It's from a pastor that I absolutely love. And he always would say, if you take a dysfunction and you call it your personality, you've created a safe space for dysfunction to dwell. And I am wrecked by that quote so often. And I honestly like tell myself that anytime I'm acting a certain way that I know that I can change my attitude or change some sort of dysfunction that I'm, claiming as to be, oh, this is just how I am. Because essentially, you don't need to act a certain way and calling it your personality, calling it, oh, this is just how I am, this is just my character, this is how I just grew up, is just honestly an excuse. Our lineage is almost equivalent to like our ancestors. Obviously, you need to go back to like you. It's not necessary to go back, super super far. Like I said, great grandparents is far enough, just because that's the oldest I think that I can remember as a kid growing up. And so anything further than that, I don't really think is necessary unless you really have like some deep shit that you're going through, then yeah, by all means go right ahead. But I feel like great grandparents is a great start, just because, you'll have a lot of similarities to your grandparents if you grew up with your grandparents, and then you'll start to understand, okay, like my grandma acts a certain way and that my dad does. So maybe I get it from her. Because sometimes things are like, they skip a generation. There's always like this like saying of like, oh, it skipped a generation and it went to, so and so. So going as far as your great grandparents would suffice enough. A perfect example that I always love to give is my grandpa on my mom's side, just because my papa loves to shop. Like he is the only person in our whole family that loves to shop. And I don't think I can find anybody else other than myself alongside him that loves to shop just as much. Like we both like feed off of each other when it comes to like shopping. Like when you get both of us in like a retail store, it's like kind of game over. Like we genuinely love to just like sit there and like look through each like article of clothing and just see what we dislike, what we like, what we see ourselves wearing. I find that to be like a moment of us like bonding, just because we have like so much in common when it comes to fashion. Obviously, we still have like different styles. Like I'm more into streetwear, he's more into like that classic look. But again, that's something that I can find in terms of similarities. That's something that's positive. A negative characteristic that I have found is I have a really bad temper. Okay, this is really bad, but it's something that I'm honestly accepting, but I'm not going to allow myself to, again, keep it as a personality or roam inside me, just because I know it's something that I can change and be better at. But I do find myself having a bit of a temper, almost a little bit towards like entitlement per se. But that's a completely different topic that I would love to discuss later on. But I've realized that my mom also has a really bad temper, and she's doing a lot better than before, but it used to be so bad growing up, to the point like where now I have so much anxiety like having a conversation with her that involves some sort of conflict. And just in the recent, I've had to have a conversation with her, and I was brutally honest with her. I'm like, hey, just so you know, I'm having a major anxiety having this convo with you, just because I used to deal with a lot of flashback in the past. And honestly, just being really transparent with her really helped us find some sort of balance of like, you know what, like this is the past. I'm working on myself now to where I don't have to have that temper. But it's something that we acknowledged, and that's something that I've realized and have gotten to the root of, like, where do I get this temper? Oh, I get it from my mom, but my mom also gets it from her mom. So like my nana also struggled with like some sort of like anger temperament problems too, I guess you can say. So again, understand where you get your characteristics from. Understanding that is the building blocks of, okay, getting to the root is imperative, because it's going to be the foundation of where do I start to implement change. And that's essentially what we're here for, is implementing change to be better, not only for ourselves, but for those around us. I think a good place to start with, identifying all of like the characteristics about yourself is start with like the little things. If you notice like, oh, my mom is really hospitable, then you're most likely prone to be really hospitable when you go out on your own and you're with a group of friends and you want to, invite everybody over. Because you grew up in that sort of environment, you're most likely going to, pick up on that trait. If you grew up with parents talking down on you all the time, whether it was your mom or your dad or, someone that you were raised by, it can go either way. One, because they talk down upon you so much, you could either be really hard on yourself growing up and you talk down upon yourself and you have a lot of insecurities due to that. Or two, you can talk down upon other people and now you're just perceived as someone who is just like, oh, like they're just, they just talk down upon everybody and they have nothing nice to say. The root of that would be, okay, well, growing up, that's all I ever got because I just wasn't good enough. And being not good enough is a huge one that I feel like a lot of people, including myself, dealt with. I still even deal with it now. Like, I feel like a lot of young adults, especially, deal with this idea of like, oh, anything I do is just not good enough. And then, the action is, oh, I'm just going to strive to be the best that they want me to be. And then you lose your self image because, and the sense of identity because it's like, well, I'm not really living for myself, I'm living for someone else. So, like I mentioned in my trailer, I love to challenge people. Anytime my friends come to me with advice or they're seeking advice, I love to, ask them questions and I love to tell them, little stepping stones that they can do to either rectify a situation, solve some sort of unclarity in their mind to better themselves and to grow. So, what I want to do for every episode is what I'm going to call the challenger. And essentially, what this is it's going to be something that you guys are going to do that is taking away from this whole episode or whichever episode you guys are watching. So, the challenger for this episode is to understand and study the actions of your family. And I know we've kind of been discussing that this whole episode, but one thing that I really want you guys to analyze, and this is something that is beneficial if you have siblings. If you are an only child, that's completely fine. But if you have a brother or sister, I want you guys to start seeing what differentiates you guys from each other in terms of the way you respond to things, the way you act in a public setting, in a private setting. For instance, if someone were to ask you guys a question, what makes you different in terms of your response? And what I mean by that is, I feel like my response to things would essentially be really similar to how my dad would respond to things. We're very logical. Sometimes we tend to be a little bit more emotional, but we like to have a lot of data and intel based responses versus like my sister, she's just kind of vague with her responses. She doesn't really have much info. She doesn't really like, go deep into like, oh, well, I just think this because I think this. Like for me, it's just a little bit more in depth, and my dad's more in depth. One of the analyzations that I think is so, 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 so imperative is one that I feel like I have been analyzing from like adolescent age. And I think it's because growing up, my dad was very, very honest with how my mom and how he would act, during their young adult life. And, I was always curious on like why like my parents got a divorce and, what was the whole, scandal or whatever. I'm a really big believer in history repeats itself, not only in the outside world, but also in our personal lives, which is why, like, I feel like a lot of parents, when they're with their kids, are like, yeah, well, growing up, I did the same thing. I did this and that. So I really want you guys to start analyzing certain actions that your parents did that are really similar to yours. I'm going to give you an example, and it's a really more in depth personal example. But again, I'm here to share all of my experiences with you guys just because I want to be really honest and I want to be really vulnerable with you guys. That way, you guys can have some sort of support in being vulnerable with yourself. So during my adolescent transitioning to young adult age, I found myself to be really promiscuous. I was just like every other boy who was just like really horny all the time. And I started noticing like certain things that were just not really the normal. I was really curious about a lot of things. And I lost my virginity at 16, but I didn't just lose it like into like some high school girl. No, I literally lost it to a 26-year-old man. And he knew I was 20. He knew I was 16. And of course, later on down the road, my therapist told me that that was child abuse and absolutely not acceptable at all. I'm not even 26 yet, and I can't even fathom to find myself, you know, interacting, even communicating with a 16-year-old to that matter. Like, it's just not acceptable in any way, shape, or form. But I realized that one of my parents went through something really similar. But I was realizing, I was like, damn, like, I thought like this is just something that, I went through because, I'm entering like this gay community and, all these gays are all horny and, they're all kind of like fucked up in the head sometimes. But I was like, damn, like I think that there's something deeper to this. And even in the current, like some of my, siblings are going through something really, really similar. This has been something that has been passed down. And obviously, like, the question arises like, okay, well, what do we do so we don't have to, have our children's children struggle? And I think that's a really good, question to ask. And I think my only response to that is one, acknowledging that it's not a good thing to carry down. Two, being very honest and vulnerable with yourself and maybe your parent or maybe like your sibling. And three, creating those fundamental steps to better yourself. That way you don't have to, have the next sibling or your child or your grandchild go through that. And even though it was something in the past, I acknowledge it now, and it's something that I want to be able to work on in the current. That way I don't have to struggle um, dealing having to deal with my children going through that. So that's just my little experience that I felt, really coincided with the Challenger topic because I think that if we don't acknowledge, familiarities, if we don't acknowledge, what our parents, grandparents went through, then, essentially we're just going to continue suffering. And that's something that we shouldn't have to bear. We shouldn't have to bear someone else's struggles into our own lives. And that's something that I wanted to really touch base on is you weren't meant to bear someone else's struggles in your life. When we start to acknowledge, our grandmother's struggle of suicide, we start to realize, damn, like I can acknowledge that I myself have thought of suicide thoughts and I don't need to bear that. So that's something that I'm taking captive. I'm acknowledging it. And even though they weren't capable or willing to work on themselves and grow, I'm going to do what they couldn't do and break that generational lineage. So essentially, this is the root. And I really want us to, you know, start writing down like all of the characteristics that are good about you and all the characteristics that are bad about you. And I guess that could be another challenger. Good, bad characteristics. Where do they come from? Who are they from? And do they still do those traits? Do they still do those actions? And what are some story times that your parents can tell you that you can be like, oh shit, like that's stuff that I've done myself. I hope that this is a really beneficial starter to my podcast. Again, I'm going to just be growing a lot, so this is just the beginning. And of course, I'm barely putting my feet into the water. So just bear with me in terms of like editing and camera footage. I will be having some special guests onto the next episode. So stay tuned for that. And yeah, I'll see you guys later.